All right. So as it pertains to this workshop, we're talking about trauma from the past. Does trauma from the past have a bearing on what we do in the present? Right? Is there a statute of limitations on trauma? We know that trauma in childhood affects parenting. We understand that the way that you were parented by your parents and the trauma that you incurred as kids directly reflected on the type of parent that you become now. The type of relationship that you had with your parents or whoever your caregiver was a direct reflection on the relationship that you have now. We know that. But what about trauma that happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago? Right? Does that have any bearing on behaviors that we see now? And the answer to that is yes. The answer to that is yes. Um, we've seen that trauma can be passed down. And so there are some terms that I want you to know, and I left one off of this PowerPoint. But if you feel inclined to go do some further research on this, which I would encourage everybody to do if you haven't, I'd look up these three things. One I left off, I apologize. But the first one is post-traumatic slave syndrome. So anybody familiar with Dr. DeGry, Dr. Joy DeGry? Fantastic, brilliant mind. Um, Dr. DeGry is an African American female, and she wrote a book called Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And
Right.
hey, Jacqueline, it's good to see you.
Hey.
Um, she connected trauma to slavery, right?
Mhm.
And she said that we're still feeling the effects of trauma to this day. Okay. So which leads me into the other term that I did not write down, but I want you when you study this and you know generally about this, what I'm getting ready to say, you're gonna already be ahead of your class. All right. So there's a term called epigenetics. 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 What is epigenetics? It is the idea that trauma can be passed down genetically. The idea that trauma can be passed down genetically. So we see that some of the trauma that happened hundreds of years ago was passed down genetically, which led to certain decisions and certain behaviors that we see today. Even things like poor eating habits and poor eating patterns. We see things like diabetes and high blood pressure, which y'all know is there's a huge disparity among African Americans, uh,
Mhm.
other races and ethnicities.
Mhm.
Whites, it's three high blood pressure and diabetes is three times as high in African Americans as it is in Caucasian Americans. And this has been generationally. I always have a hard time saying that word. Generationally, right? It's been passed down. And so just like those medical conditions are passed down, right? We also know that there are mental health conditions that are passed down. You have predisposition, right? Depression, we know is one. ADHD, we know is one, right? They're bipolar. You can have a predisposition. These things are actually encoded on the gene pool. All it takes for is a level of stress to activate them. We know that
Mhm.
those things are passed down. We've always known that. We didn't always know that your trauma is passed down, like your great great grandfather who was in slavery, right? The trauma that was incurred to him was passed down because we know that trauma is stored in the body. And for anybody who's a research nerd or nut like me, there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. The Body Keeps the Score. And you know, I don't throw down corporal punishment. I got three boys of my own. I understand how it works, but we got to be very careful with how we discipline our young people, especially if they come from a traumatized history, because we know that trauma is stored in the body, right? Two primary places in the stomach and the butt. And so we can actually be re-traumatizing people by hitting them. Where'd that come from? Being hit in slavery. Being hit in slavery. That was passed down, right? And so we know that trauma is also stored. And so post-traumatic slave syndrome, Dr. DeGraw does a great job of explaining that. I would encourage everybody to read that. And I know physically we've been removed from slavery. Socially, we've come a long way. There's a lot of social restraints that have been lifted, but there is still institutional slavery, right? There is still constructional slavery, and you live long enough, you'll run into it. You live long enough, you'll run into it. I didn't used to believe it when I was a teenager. I was like, oh, slavery doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, just be a black man, start trying to apply for jobs. Just be a black sister and be more educated and more equipped, but there's a glass ceiling at your office, right? You just live long enough, you'll see it. Then the third one. So we had post-traumatic slave syndrome, epigenetics, and the third one is the Trail of Tears. Who's ever heard of the Trail of Tears? Just raise your hand. All right. So please go research the Trail of Tears. You all know that the Vikings, the Caucasians, us, whoever else, were not the first people here in America. There were people already here, Native Americans. This was their land first. All right. This was their land. Christopher Columbus did not discover America in 1492. Hey, baby, my wife is on here. I didn't even see it. Christopher Columbus did not discover America in 1492. As a matter of fact, Eric the Red was here in the year 1000 before him. But before Eric the Red, who was here? Native Americans. And so guess what they did? The settlers came and pushed these Native Americans off their land, all the way from the South, all the way up north. And what they did was there was one significant incident in history we all got to be familiar with, because before slavery, there was a Trail of Tears. They took these Indians and they told them to go up north. This is our land now. They tricked them out of the land. They made them sign contracts in English that they did not understand. They raped and killed their women. They took their cattle and all of their agriculture, and they pushed them up north. And they say, okay, you guys go from here and go up north, and I don't care how you make it, you just got to go. And thousands of Indians died along the way. And so the Native Americans call it the Trail of Tears, that passage from down south to up north. Now you see small pockets of Native American lands. And for those of you all who work for DCFS, y'all have heard of stuff like ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, where we're trying to respect the Native American heritage that was here before anybody else was here and give them some form of governance. But make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, we killed a lot of Indians in the United States of America. Like a lot of African Americans were killed, so a lot of Native Americans killed, right? So that impact, though we are free, though we've made advancements, that impact is still being felt today. All right, that impact is still being felt today. All right, questions about that before we move on? All right, so post-traumatic slave syndrome, Trail of Tears, and please research epigenetics. All right. So when we say culture, let's give that word some definition, because there's some sub-ideas in culture. Like the way I raise my kids, the food that we eat, celebrations, the jokes that we tell, right? Those are culture. There are certain jokes that we can tell in this circle right here that if we were to leave this circle and we were to meet with another ethnicity and nationality, they couldn't say it. They couldn't tell it, right? Not without some fighting words coming up. So that's a part of our culture, right? The language that we use. I can talk to one of my homeboys right now. Both of us are professionals. I'm gonna get on the phone. I'm gonna say, nigga, what's going on with you? And he's gonna say it back, but it's a term of endearment. But if we leave this space, right, you can't use that, right? That's an endearing term for us. It's our language, right? Some of us on here may use slang. Doesn't mean that we unprofessional. Doesn't mean we don't know how to talk. But that's our terms of endearment. So those are cultural ideals. So when we say culture, we're talking about the communication and interaction guide of a group of individuals. African Americans have a culture. Caucasians have a culture. Native Americans have a culture. Doesn't make us better than any other culture. We just have different cultures, the way we were raised, the way we were brought up. And so those cultures should be respected. So if we were to give it a broader definition, we would say the shared values, traditions, arts, history, folklore, and institutions of a group of people that are unified by race, ethnicity, nationality, language, religious beliefs, spirituality, social economic status, social class, sexual orientation, politics, gender, age, disability, or any other cohesive group or value. That would be the scientific term for culture. And Singh developed that in 1998. Does anybody who cares to share, maybe you have a tradition in your family, like just your family, not just African Americans in general, but maybe that you share as your family, that you like to share on here. Anybody have like a tradition, something y'all do maybe at Thanksgiving or Christmas that's kind of like this is what we do as a family or as a group. Don't worry, we won't laugh at you. We got something too.
We don't necessarily have a tradition in our family, but we say I love you all the time. When we wake up in the mornings, when we get off the phone with each other, when we're separating, going our separate ways, we never leave each other without saying I love you. So I have a habit of saying I love you. My office mate don't believe that I mean it. She just says she don't. But
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's just we do not have a problem expressing I care about you, I'm concerned about you, I want to know that you're okay. And
Yeah.
I have absolutely no problem telling people that I care and that I'm concerned about, that I love them.
I love that. That's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. That's a tradition. And that's based on the value system too. I love that. Anybody else who grew up like me and you got cousins? It's not actually your cousins, but your folks told you that was your cousin just because they were around the family. Anybody like that? I grew up. I didn't know who my real people were because everybody was your cousin or your uncle. That was you, LaShonda. You got people, and you found out they weren't your people.
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have a
That's just
few.
you got a few of them. Yeah,
Yes,
but they just like blood. They're just
yes,
like
they
blood.
just like blood. We treat them like
Yeah,
blood. They treat us. We're family.
yeah. Now you go to another culture, they're not having that because in their mind, that's gonna give you some right to some type of privilege, or if I die, some type of inheritance. So they're not having that. So we're not calling you cousin if you're not my cousin. We're not calling you sister because we're in the same fraternity. They're not doing that. Right? It just depends on your culture.
I
All
have
right.
one I would like to share.
Are you gonna share the ham one, baby?
Huh?
Are you gonna share the ham one? I was gonna ask you to share the ham one. I don't know if
No,
that's the one you
I'm not.
want. Okay.
I'm not.
Okay.
You
Okay.
share your own.
Go
We
ahead.
have a culture. My grandmother had 10 children, 7 boys, 3 girls. And the girls, when they come and visit us to our house, they have like this entitlement thing. So we're supposed to serve them like queens, and we do.
Yes, Lord.
We cook for them, we do various things for them, and they just sit there like, bring me this, bring me that. And we help to serve them when they come the best we can.
Yes, y'all do. All right. Well, thank
I'm
y'all for
not like that
sharing.
though, y'all, okay? Not me.
You not, baby. You not like that. Well, thank y'all for sharing. So this term that's come around now, and if you're working in the social services related space, they've been talking about cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity. And so you might get a training on it. People usually going to put it in their handbook because it's just a big thing. And it's true. We should be culturally sensitive. But there's been a term that's been floating around for a couple of years, which I much more prefer, called cultural responsiveness. Because you can know that we got cultural differences, but that don't mean you're doing anything about it, right? And so if I do something about it, that's cultural responsiveness. And so that's cultivated in the idea that there's cultural humility. So two individuals developed this term of cultural humility. They said it's another way to understand and develop a process-oriented approach to competency. So they said that one of the areas that we should grow in as professionals is being culturally humble. And the definition that Hook gave was the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other oriented. And I'm by my value system, I'm biblically oriented. And so the other oriented speaks to me, right? And African Americans in general, we have the idea of looking out for each other. We have a village mentality, a village focus. But they said that our stance is to be other oriented or open to other people in aspects to their cultural identity that are important to the person. So that means that no matter where I am, what platform I have, my responsibility is to find out what matters to you. Is to find out what's important to you. And so that may mean I have to lower myself a little bit and come where you are. So for those of you all in social work, you know that a term that's really important for us is that we meet people where they are. And that's what I think about when I think about cultural humility, right? So that's going to take away any idea, or it's going to take away any assertion that I'm better than another human being. And so, by the way, all of these isms, racism, sexism, whatever the ism has the presupposition that I'm better than you. That's the presupposition. And so when we see these groups of individuals who don't respect another person's culture, what they're saying at the same time, without saying it is that I'm better than you. That I'm better than you. All right. So they talked about 3 factors that guide a person towards cultural humility: lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique. So I'm always looking in the mirror, making sure that I'm preferring other people. Number 2, desire to fix power imbalances where none ought to exist. And that may not necessarily be on a governmental level, but maybe you work in a place where people are taken advantage of, talked down to. Maybe you're the person, that's getting overlooked because of your skin color or because of your hair or because of your makeup, whatever the case may be. But there's got to be something in us, especially those that are in a social work arena, because we took a quote unquote vow and oath to protect the vulnerable, that we gotta say something. We got to be able to say something. You may be able to say something in your own little way, but where we see things are not right, we got to say something. And then getting in partnerships with people who advocate for others. And so our organization, by its DNA, is an advocacy organization. And so I would encourage those of you all who are not a part of some group, some cohort, some institution that's fighting social injustice, that you be a part. You don't necessarily have to be on the side, handing up, holding up signs, right? But we all can do our part. Dr. Martin Luther King, and I'm going to misquote him. I don't remember the specific quote, but it was something like, it was in this area. He said, an injustice somewhere is an injustice everywhere. An injustice to one of us is an injustice to all of us. There is nobody here in America who says that doesn't pertain to me. That doesn't pertain to me and my family. Absolutely it does. May not directly pertain to you, but there are some laws that's being developed. Something's going on at the school board. Something's going down at city court. Something's going on at a municipal level that's affecting your quality of life as a person of color. It's absolutely how it works in this country. Nobody escapes that. So we want to get involved and do our part. All right, I want to show you a short video. Dr. Gorno did a video on historical trauma. It's interesting because she's a Caucasian female, but she gets it. And so a couple of things I want you to be thinking about as you watch this video. It's a short video. So number 1, like, what messages might promote or reinforce negative cultural stereotypes? Maybe at your job, maybe in your community, maybe in your family. Are you aware of positive messages about culture? Like, are we paying attention to those things? And I'll stop with those 2 questions. I may get into the other questions later, but I want to show the video.
What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it.
My dad said when they were growing up, they said, we used to play cowboys and Indians. And he started telling me this story. And we used to fight over, nobody wanted to be the Indian. And he said, I didn't think about that. We'd all play, and I'd always suck it up and I'd be the Indian. But how ironic is it for a bunch of Indian children to be playing cowboys and Indians and nobody wants to be the Indian? The introduction of a destruction of culture and loss of what is good. And I asked my dad, well, why didn't anybody want to be the Indian? And I thought I knew the answer. He said, because everybody knows the Indian dies. And that already in his generation, as strong as he was, he received a message as a young child. I received the same message, that it was not good to be Indian.
Slavery, colonization, forced relocation, and other historically traumatic events in generations past have lingering and profound consequences today. But what is historical trauma?
Historical trauma has to do with collective, cumulative emotional wounding over and across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events. These are events that don't just target an individual, but they target a whole collective community. Things like forced relocation from traditional homelands, like the Trail of Tears, like my ancestors went through. But the process that our communities talk a lot about is that the trauma is held personally, and it can be transmitted over generations. So even family members who have not had a direct experience of the trauma itself can feel the effects of that event generations later.
Does historical trauma only affect certain groups of people?
What really helps me to help people understand the notion of historical trauma is that it's actually a phenomenon that lots of communities, indigenous communities, or people all over the world have sort of struggled with. It's not something that specifically is only owned by tribal people or indigenous people. It gets articulated all over the world.
Historical trauma is widespread, affecting many communities across the globe.
Observation has, from the empirical side, started with work on the Holocaust survivors. And there's a lot of work on intergenerational transmission of trauma. And it's moved into also looking at Japanese internment survivors, Armenian survivors, descendants of their Holocaust, and so forth. So there's been some more empirical work in this area. And you can imagine trying to track trauma over generations and trying to tease out what is the impact over generations on this child, combined with whatever traumatic events they've gone through in their childhood and in their lifetime.
Historical trauma is passed on across generations.
I say to you, acknowledgement is due my grandfather, Pop. He never told us the stories of why he did certain things. He never shared with us why he never cried, for example. He never shared with us why he walked out the door when my grandmother cried. Why he turned his back when she cried. Of course we thought he turned his back because he didn't care, of course. But he turned his back, as I look back now, because the pain has no words. I still have the images of him dealing with the limitations that he was up against. I can only imagine the pain. But what I do know is that it didn't go away. It came inside into those of us who followed him.
No one ever talks about the moment you found out that you were white, or the moment you found out that you were black. That's a profound revelation. The minute you find that out, something happens. You have to renegotiate everything, and that's a profound psychological moment.
I saw a water fountain that said white in color. My family was 7 kids by then. We drank a lot of Kool-Aid. So colored water, that was in my cognitive schema. So I go toward this colored water fountain. And while I'm there, just before I get there, there's a little white girl who saw that same colored water fountain, and she was just about to turn the sprocket when her mother came and grabbed her by the arm. And she said, "You cannot drink from that colored water fountain." And she said, "But I want the colored water! I want the colored water! Oh, I want the colored water!" So I knew it must be good. So I run to the colored water fountain, looking for my mom, making sure she won't stop me from drinking. And I turned the water fountain, and it was clear, just like at home. That day, that trauma, I remember to this moment.
For African American communities, historical identity and understanding is inextricably tied to the reality of enslavement.
It ties us to enslavement, with what an awful terror, 400 years of trauma we experienced. And for us, we talk about it as being utter cultural erasure.
So one of the things that they mentioned that I wanted to highlight, um, they were talking about various experiences, and some of the things that she was talking about isn't that far removed. We're talking about the 60s. There's certain fountains that you couldn't drink out of, and that's become a point, of trauma for the young lady who was speaking last. But one of the things that one of the speakers highlighted was the situation with the dad. Right, I see my wife crying. I just walk out because I don't know what to do. And one of the things that we see, as far as epigenetics is concerned, um, is that one of the things that's passed down is being emotionally closed off, especially in males, especially in males. So, and I heard somebody say the other day, um, women have emotions and feelings and men don't. Right. And I get why they said that, because I've been doing marriage counseling for about 13 years. And I heard a lot of that. So I understand the context of it. But it's not true. That idea that men don't have emotions is not true. If you're a human being, you have emotions, right? Now, having emotions and expressing emotions are two different things. So a man may not express his emotions the same way, right? He may have a range of emotions and not have been taught how to use them or even been sanctioned for using them. And we're going to talk about microaggressions in a moment, because you can't get upset in public. You can't be mad in public, or you're going to be seen as the angry black guy, right? That may be the case. But we all have emotions. But one of the things that we see is that these emotions don't get expressed. So when your wife cries and she shows some level of vulnerability, then that expression from the male isn't there, right? And we see that's one of the things that we're seeing passed down as far as epigenetics is concerned. So we're having to go back with men and helping them to heal emotionally before we ever start talking about, getting into long-term relationships, like finding out like who you are, what you're supposed to be doing here on earth. A lot of it is just healing there first. Because a guy, and this is across the board, this experience is with women as well, but it's predominantly with men. So you'll hear some men say, I only have two ways to do it. They only got a couple of emotions that they're working with. I know anger, I know happiness, and a lot of stuff in between I'm not really sure of. Right. So having to go back and teach that. So I just wanted to highlight that point because that's one of the things that we see in epigenetics. All right. Who's impacted by historical trauma? American Indians, First Nation peoples, immigrants, people of color, families living in poverty, primarily are impacted. And so some of the manifestations that we see, people begin to internalize the views of the oppressor, perpetuate a cycle of self-hatred that manifests itself in a negative behavior. I never forget, when this kind of came to my front doorstep as a parent. Um, I don't know if I think it may have been my wife who did it, but anyway, I think it was two or three of my kids. I'm not sure, but I remember they were outside playing. They came in, and something had happened in the neighborhood. But anyway, the conversation started with like they wanted to be white, right? And then so we're not jumping on them, for saying that. We're trying to get an understanding, like why you want to be white. And at that age, and I think they may have been, correct me if I'm wrong, baby, maybe like 9. Titus may have been like maybe 9. Legend was like 8. Christian was like 6. But whatever the case was, they were young enough to have felt the oppression at their age, internalized it. And my youngest son, it took him a while to really embrace and love his skin color. My wife spent a lot of time with him on that because like white was acceptable. Now we never taught them that, right? they're homeschooled, right? And so this is just a few years of public school. And that's the message they had got. Because when you turn the pages in the books in school, guess what color all of the people in the books are? They're white, right? Most of their teachers are white. And so they've been taught that black was bad. That message gets promoted over and over and over and over and over again, socioeconomically. Whether you can visually see it or not, it is ingrained structurally in this country. And so you walk around with the weight of feeling like a second class citizen because of your skin color. That's still happening in 2024. 2024. So emotions such as anger, hatred, aggression, self-inflicted, as well as inflicted on members, their own group. I've worked with guys who struggle with anger, domestic violence, not picking on guys, I'm just giving an example because that's who I'm familiar with. I work primarily with men. And, they have these physically destructive behaviors. And a lot of this stuff is internal. The wounds are internal. They don't have a way to express this stuff outside of their home context, and they bring that pain home. They bring that hurt home. They let it out on the people that they love. Unintentionally, a lot of times, unconsciously, but nevertheless, they're still doing it, right? They're still doing it. And so not negating them of their responsibilities, because you got to take responsibility for your own actions. But I'm just talking about the arrows that are in your back while you're still trying to be a productive citizen in this country, right? The walls that are in front of you that you got to climb and try to knock down as you make progress. That's what we're talking about. All right. So some symptoms of historical trauma. I'll just highlight this really quickly, and then I'll get to one more video. I think we'll stop there. But I wanted to point this out because sometimes people are saying be resilient, be resilient, be resilient, or we become resilient, which is true. We're the only people to generate a renaissance 100 years after slavery. Go check out what happened in Harlem. I do agree. We are resilient. But there is still a lot of adversity that causes other things that we may not be privy to or aware of, right? Like anxiety, anger, shame. There's girls right now. Y'all have heard these stories. There's young teenage girls right now in middle school. They went to school and they went to the beauty salon. They had their hair done or had their hair out and went to school, and somebody told them that was unacceptable and shamed them for wearing their hair naturally. Right? This is 2023, 2024, right? Made them feel bad about having coarse hair. Right? That's still happening today. And so the shame is there. So it's hard to focus in school when everybody's got their eyes on you, or the person who's over you sees your image as unacceptable, right? There's something wrong with you. All right, then we see violence and suicide and all of these socioeconomic risk factors that are pervasive because of the adversity that you have to face every day. All right, and so that historical trauma, like I said, is perpetuated today. We see microaggressions. If anybody's unfamiliar with that term, microaggressions are the aggressions that are under the surface. They're not overt experiences that I can say, hey, what you just did was racist. Or what you just did was physically aggressive. What you just did was assaultive. These are little subtle things, subtle comments, subtle behaviors that exist in our community, right? And so these are the things that can become hurtful if they're unaddressed or if we're even unaware of what's been said. I was working with a gentleman. He lives in Washington. Washington State's not a lot of black people there, in particular in his city, and but he's struggling right now because most of his peer group are Caucasians. But they'll say little things like, I think the last thing he told me, I'm gonna make up a name. He said they were all together, they were camping, and everybody else was white except him. And he said, because he's a darker skinned brother, and one of his friends said, hey Mike, we can't see you. and everybody started laughing, right? And it wasn't supposed to be a big deal, but he couldn't enjoy it the rest of his trip because he didn't know how to take that. It's a microaggression. And the guy was like, "Oh, I'm just kidding. You know we homeboys." But remember, I told y'all, culturally, there's certain things you can't say, certain things you can't do. But those microaggressions are happening every day. So let me show this quick video, and then we'll come to a close.
There are many examples of historically traumatic events that have had long-lasting consequences on people and communities today.
These events include planned phenomenon by government and government-sponsored institutions. It also includes environmental trauma and spiritual trauma. But in 1879, the federal government started doing a couple of different things in terms of Indian policy that's really important to know about. One of the things that the government decided was that we were more human than they thought we were before. And what happened was three major movements happened. One is we became eligible to be declared insane. The other was we became educable. The third is our religion became outlawed.
One example of an historically traumatic event was the creation of mandatory boarding schools for Native American children.
Off-reservation boarding schools where kids were taken from their homes and placed far away. And the idea is they didn't want any contact with community or culture or family. There was forced removal for a lot of these kids with no return until they were young adults back to their communities. So by 1909, there were more than 25 off-reservation boarding schools, more than at least 100,000, we think, Native children forced to attend these schools during that period. And attendance was mandatory or the parents would be imprisoned or fined.
How were families affected by the trauma of being forced to attend the American Indian boarding schools?
I'm just going to give you an example of some of the breakup of the family and how that affects a person on a cellular level with this historical trauma. My one uncle really always struggled, and I always wondered, why was he different? Finally, my dad told me the story. He said, your grandma won't tell you. They came onto the reservation and they were taking children and forcibly putting them into boarding schools. And so she played a game and she said, you guys, we're going to go play hide and seek. Well, he was outside. He got caught and he was sent away. So when you compare my father and my uncle, he goes, why won't grandma talk? He says, it's too painful. She can't talk about that. It's too painful. So she never talked about that. But you can see the difference in how his life went in comparison to my father's.
So here's an example of Carlisle. These schools were militaristic in fashion, not surprising since it was modeled off of a prison. Look how young these kids are. Some of them are really young, 3, 4 years old, being sent off to these schools. Now, what do we know? They were not parented. They were forced to not speak their language, and in some cases encountered torture and physical brutality if they did anything cultural. They encountered sexual abuse at incredibly high rates. 90% of kids were sexually abused in some communities. So what happens to this generation? They don't learn traditional knowledge around their stories, around how to relate to each other, how to parent, how to discipline, how to express themselves in all kinds of ways. And what they learn is harsh physical punishment, militaristic ways of living. So you can imagine the impact.
The trauma of these types of historical events is still felt and expressed in communities today.
Some of the potential symptoms of dealing with historical trauma response reactions, and that includes things like obsessive rumination about the deceased, intrusive thoughts or dreams or nightmares of historically traumatic events, survivor guilt over not living the experience.
Chronic contemporary experiences, called microaggressions, can perpetuate historical trauma.
The microaggressions are the chronic everyday injustices that we endure. They're the interpersonal and environmental messages. So these are verbal and nonverbal encounters that places the burden on us as Indigenous people or the recipient of that encounter to negotiate them.
When I started noticing that angel's food cake is white, but devil's food cake, chocolate, right? Male is all right to get unless it's black male. Magic was all right unless it was black magic. And in our society, even a lie becomes all right if it's a white lie.
But it can also have to do with images that are in our environment, or the lack of images in our environment that is part of that microaggression distress. So it gets really tiring seeing this stuff all the time. And what this does is it cartoonizes us. It makes us unidimensional. It makes us not be seen. It renders us invisible because we are not these. Our invisibility has been reinforced through microaggressive experiences.
Many people struggle to cope with the long-lasting effects of historical trauma.
One of the ways we coped was we developed maladaptive coping mechanisms. A real prevalent problem in tribal communities is the issues around substance abuse. It's probably one of the biggest issues in tribal communities in terms of a mental health or a behavioral health problem. The result of that is erosions in tribal and family systems. That, of course, led to more violence and more stress. And these are phenomena that sort of impact individuals, families, and communities in this very cyclical process across generations.
The residue of unresolved, historic, traumatic experiences and generational or unresolved grief is not only being passed from generation to generation, it is continuously being acted out and recreated.
Why do our people keep continuing the same cycles that they're already been in, right? The sign of the ultimate oppression working is when the oppressor is able to take away his hands and stand back and go, wow, look at what they're doing to themselves.
All right. And so we see that, you know, those microaggressions are still there. I did see one instance where we're making progress with changing some of those things. Maybe y'all have heard this before. I don't know if any of you all are football fans or watch football. Any football fans on here? Probably some Cowboy fans on here. Lord have mercy, help us. Any Saints fans on here? Some Saints fans on here. But there was a football team. I don't know if y'all are familiar with it, called the Washington Redskins. Anybody ever heard of that? Maybe your husband, somebody that's their favorite team. They changed the name. Indians start complaining and saying, wait a minute, because on the side of the helmet they had this picture of this Native American male Indian on their helmets, and they changed it. So now that team is called the Washington Commanders. They said, y'all don't have a helmet with a white man on the side of it. You don't have a helmet with an African American on the side of it, saying the California Negroes. Why we gotta have, the Washington Redskins? That's a derogatory term. So they changed it, and they're looking at doing that across other sports. But it's a step in the right direction. But some of these microaggressions still exist, right? Angel's food cake, white lies, those things are still pervasive. All right, so the goal is, as we close, the goal is to go from cultural destructiveness to cultural proficiency. If I'm talking to somebody and we're asking, how do I help? There's a spectrum. There is, like, you can be on one end of the spectrum where you're really hurting. Your responsibility is to continue to keep this pattern going. Like, so these are white supremacists, Ku Klux Klan, all of these self-hate groups. Their job is to try to be in the dominant group and then suppress everybody else. And then what the shift would be to is to cultural proficiency, where there's changes that are visibly being implemented, and that goes all the way up to politics. Listen, I just want to leave you all with this note. If we are not making changes on the policy level, we're not making changes. You can start in your house, you can start in the community, that's all good. But if they don't change the laws, and like one law that they just changed not too long ago, right, that I don't know if y'all know, in Louisiana law, they still had that slavery was legal. They just like changed that last year. So they were using that in the penal system. They were finding these brothers who used marijuana for the first time. And at one time they got caught using marijuana, they were giving them like 2 years of hard labor. And so they shipped that brother off, and they were using free labor to produce, like, the tags that you put on vehicles, all that type of stuff. Those brothers was making that for free. Well, the reason that they could get away with that, because there was this little hidden law that we could technically use this free slave labor. Like, that stuff is still in the infrastructure. So we don't know that, and we just think, well, policy is for somebody else. That's not for us. We're gonna be affected by that stuff. That can be your son or your nephew, right? And so we're not making significant change. I won't say we're not making change. I take that back. That's irresponsible. we're not making significant change if we're not doing it at a policy level. And that's ultimately where we want to go to. And so I'll leave you all with that. Any questions, thoughts, or comments before I let you all go? All right, awesome. So I do want to highlight for those that just got on, if you want a CEU certificate, please email us at abswnorth@gmail.com. I put it in the chat, and then we'll get you your certificate within a week or two.
Eric and Donna have pledged their vows.
And so we want to thank you all. I want to thank you all for your participation. Listen, I want to encourage you all. I want to extend another invitation to join our organization, ABSW North Louisiana chapter. Visit our website, absw-nlrc.org. We love for you to be a part. You don't have to be a social worker. You just got to be in the social services related field and adhere to our code of conduct, our code of ethics. It's all you got to do. And so we'll be here. We'll be here. If anybody needs to get in contact with me and you have more questions, I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and I love to answer your questions. It'd be either me or our vice president. Her name is Shavella. I don't think she's on here today, but either one of us will answer your questions. So we'll be back here second Thursday in March. If you'd like to be a part of our mailing list, to know when these CEU opportunities are coming out and who's going to be speaking, when you email us for that CEU, please just put to add me to the mailing list, and we'll be sure to do that. All right, you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and y'all be blessed. Talk to you soon.